Alright, let's get started. My name is Steve. I'm going to be taking you through the Circle Sentencing Evaluation, which was a collaboration with my co-author, Elizabeth Moore. So to begin with, over the 2016-17 financial year, Indigenous Australians constituted about 3% of the general population. Over the same period, however, they constituted around 28% of the incarcerated population. Clearly, this overrepresentation of Indigenous people in custody is a problem. Now, there are a lot of programs designed to address this very issue. Ultimately, the objective of such programs is to reduce Indigenous incarceration rates without increasing recidivism or reoffending. Circle sentencing is one such program. So what is circle sentencing? Well, it's an alternative sentencing option with the full sentencing power of a traditional court for Aboriginal offenders that meet a specific set of conditions, which I'm going to outline shortly. In practice, circle sentencing typically involves the presiding magistrate working with a group of Aboriginal elders, victims, police, and the offender's family to determine the appropriate sentence. So everybody coming up for circle sentencing has already been found guilty of whatever their offence is, and now we're just determining what the penalty is. During a circle, the participants sit and they discuss things like the circumstances that led to the offence, the effect of the offence on the victim, and how similar crimes have been impacting the community. This is a map of New South Wales, and the green areas show where circle sentencing is available. So for context, Sydney's over here. So you can see from this map that circle sentencing is mostly available in regional areas, right? So it was introduced in 2002 with 8 objectives. 7 of these objectives are about improving the level of engagement between Aboriginal communities and the justice system. So qualitative research that has already been done suggests that circle sentencing has achieved these objectives. The 8th objective, the final one, is about reducing recidivism. There's only one quantitative study to date about recidivism and circle sentencing. Specifically, Jackie Fitzgerald back in 2008 found that circle sentencing had no association with recidivism. So with that in mind, our study is going to be trying to answer the following 3 questions. First, are offenders participating in circle sentencing less likely to receive a prison sentence? So we're looking at the probability of a prison sentence. Second outcome, are offenders participating in circle sentencing less likely to reoffend in 12 months? So our second outcome is the probability of at least one reoffense in 12 months. Our third outcome is, do offenders participating in circle sentencing take longer to reoffend if they do? So our third outcome is the number of days between when circle sentencing occurred and the offender's first reoffense, if indeed they did reoffend. So you'll notice 2 things. The first of which is we look at prison and then 2 different measures of reoffending. One thing I want to say up front is that roughly 18% of offenders in our sample get a prison sentence. When we look at reoffending, we're going to look at the remaining 82% of offenders that do not get a prison sentence. Why? Well, if, for example, offenders that undergo circle sentencing are less likely to go to prison, then the question becomes, if they're not going to prison, are they more likely to reoffend? Because if they're not going to prison and they're no more likely to reoffend, in some sense we can kind of justify this not sending them to prison, right? On the other hand, if they are less likely to go to prison but more likely to reoffend, then we'd start to question whether or not they should have received a prison sentence. So that's an overview of the research questions we're going to be answering in this study. We use 2 data sets. The first is an extract from BOXAR, or the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research's Reoffending Database, or ROD. What do we have in ROD? Well, we've got information for all court appearances finalised in New South Wales between 1996 and July 2019. For each defendant, we can see things like their age, sex, measures of socioeconomic status, remoteness of their sort of postcode where they live, measures of prior offending, prison sentences, those kind of things. For each case in ROD, because remember, an individual can have multiple cases, we can see the number and type of charges that they were up for, as well as whether they were granted bail, and we've got a whole bunch of key dates. So you can see the date that the offence was alleged to have taken place, the date the bail hearing occurred, the date the sentence was handed down. So that's ROD. The second data set is an extract from the Aboriginal Services Unit's internal database. The ASU is a business unit inside the new Department of Communities and Justice, formerly the Department of Justice. So with respect to the ASU internal database, what we can see here is information relating to all participating offenders' first referral and subsequent circle between March 2005 and August 2018. We can see whether their circle was cancelled, whether they were deemed unsuitable, or whether they withdrew consent. We've got some key dates. So after we stick these two data sets together, that's going to be the data set that we work with in the analysis. Recall from earlier I said there were conditions in order to participate in circle sentencing. There are 5 conditions which I'm going to outline here. The first is that you have to be Aboriginal. The second is that you have to be found guilty of a non-excluded offence. Which offences are excluded? Well, they're typically really serious offences like rape and sexual offences, those kind of offences. You have to be appearing at a participating local court. You have to be likely to serve a relevant sentence, which in this context is kind of like prison or an ICO. You have to be deemed suitable by the local community justice group, or ACJAG, that's how it's pronounced. In order to be deemed suitable, so in order to meet this last condition here, you have to undergo the following process. The magistrate, after you've been found guilty, refers you for a suitability assessment. The ACJAG then meet to discuss the offender's suitability. Things they consider are the defendant's connectedness to the local community, the impact of the offence on the community, the nature of the offence, and the benefits of the circle to the community more broadly. And then the ACJAG decide whether or not you're suitable. If you are, then you undergo circle sentencing. If you're not, then you undergo traditional sentencing. Now, before moving on, there's one point we want to make clear. The point is that these first 4 conditions we can see in the data, and we can therefore control for them. This last one, whether you're deemed suitable by the ACJAG, we can't see information about. Why is this important? Well, it's important because the suitability assessment generates this kind of selection bias problem. What's the idea? The idea is that offenders undergoing circle sentencing may systematically differ from offenders undergoing traditional sentencing. The idea is that maybe, for example, an offender who is more connected to the local community, which is, remember, something we can't see, is both less likely to reoffend and more likely to participate in circle sentencing. So perhaps this type of offender would have been less likely to reoffend either way. And the screening mechanism, that is, in order to participate in circle sentencing, you have to go through this screening mechanism, which is the suitability assessment, kind of puts this wedge between people that go through circle sentencing and other offenders in ROD. But maybe it's not a problem, so let's have a look. So this table provides some descriptive statistics which do not tell us anything about how effective the program is, but they tell us about the types of offenders that are coming up for circle sentencing and traditional sentencing. So let's have a look here in this first column. This is for people that underwent traditional sentencing. This column is for people that underwent circle sentencing, and this column is the difference between the two. So for starters, we can see that in our sample, we've got about 92,000 people that meet those first 4 conditions for circle sentencing. 655 people that actually went through circle sentencing. Now we can start to sort of paint a picture of these guys. So for example, if we have a look at this row here, we can see that 28.5% of people undergoing traditional sentencing in our sample were up for a violent crime. For people undergoing circle sentencing, it was 47.4%. That's a difference of 19 percentage points. So what does that say? It says that people that are undergoing circle sentencing are more likely to come up for a violent crime. However, they're less likely, wrong pencil again, good job, Steve. There we go, folks. Less likely to be coming up for a property crime, less likely to be coming up for a drug crime, and less likely to be coming up for an offence against justice procedures. When we go down, we can continue looking at these defendant case characteristics. I'm just going to draw this here so you know what's going on. And I'm just going to pick out a couple of these characteristics. So you can see that people undergoing circle sentencing are about a year younger. They are also a little bit younger when they first made contact with the justice system on average. They are from more disadvantaged areas. they are more likely to be from a remote area. They've also got a higher number of concurrent charges. They're up for a more serious offence, which we already know because they're coming up for a violent offence. However, they were also more likely to be granted bail. They were more likely to have pled guilty and therefore shown remorse. And they've also got fewer prior court appearances with a conviction and fewer prior prison sentences. So when we zoom out, we can kind of start to see this. Maybe the selection bias cuts both ways. The red stuff indicates that maybe people undergoing circle sentencing are more risky. Remember, they're a bit younger, they're up for a violent offence, a more serious charge. However, the stuff in green says maybe they're less risky, right? They were more likely to be granted bail, more likely to plead guilty, and they've got fewer priors. Which way does the selection bias cut? We don't know. So this is basically a summary of what I just said. Clearly, the two groups systematically differ. There's some evidence to suggest that offenders participating in circle sentencing are more risky. Some evidence to suggest that they're less risky. Evidence for both arguments. It's impossible to see which effect is going to dominate. So the best thing we can do is fit a model that controls for everything I just showed you on that table and see what results come out. And to be clear, we have not accounted for the selection bias induced by the suitability assessment. So we might be over or underestimating the true causal effect of circle sentencing. The best thing we can show you is the association between circle sentencing and the outcomes I described to you earlier after controlling for everything we can see in the data. So what are all these little symbols? This is the outcome, for example, the probability of a prison sentence. This just tells you whether or not our individual went through circle sentencing. These guys over here, they just control for everything I just showed you on the table. This little lambda t term is what's called a month by year fixed effect. And the general idea here is we limit our comparison to people that were sentenced in the same month year. Why would we want to do something like that? Well, things that are common to everybody in the state. So, for example, the unemployment rate, seasonality in crime, legislative changes, advances in security technology are all controlled for. This is just an error term, and that about sums it up. So here are the main results. This is after we control for those month-by-year fixed effects and the other control variables I just described. This is for traditional sentencing, this is for circle sentencing, and this first box here is the probability of a prison sentence. From here, we can see that people that underwent traditional sentencing have an 18% chance of going to prison. People that underwent circle sentencing had an 8.7% chance of going to prison, and that's a difference of 9.3 percentage points. Over here in the next box, the blue one, we look at the probability of at least one reoffence in 12 months. Again, this is for traditional sentencing, circle sentencing. You can see guys that went through traditional sentencing, 40.5% of them reoffended within 12 months. Circle sentencing, 36.6%. So that's a reduction of 3.9 percentage points. And here, finally, in the green box, we look at the number of days between sentencing and the first reoffence. If you underwent traditional sentencing, you reoffended within, 478 days. Circle sentencing, you reoffended within 533 days. In other words, it took you 55 days longer to reoffend if and when you do. So to summarize this slide, offenders that go through circle sentencing are basically half as likely to get a prison sentence. If they don't get a prison sentence, they're less likely to reoffend. And if they do reoffend, they take almost 2 months longer. So this is, so far, remember this isn't causal, but so far this is pretty good evidence to suggest that circle sentencing is associated with beneficial outcomes when it comes to both sentencing and recidivism. So, quick recap. Offenders undergoing circle sentencing are less likely to get a prison sentence, less likely to reoffend, and take longer to reoffend if and when they do. However, these results could be due to circle sentencing, or selection bias, or maybe a bit of both. So for the remainder of this presentation, we're going to dig into specifically the reoffending result a little bit and try and understand it a bit better. So how are we going to do this? We're going to do it in two ways. The first way, we're going to examine the mechanism through which a reduction in reoffending might occur. The second way, we're going to break our measure of reoffending down into reoffending for specific types of reoffences. So first things first, where is this reduction coming from? Well, maybe circle groups are able to assign better penalties than a magistrate working in isolation. Remember, circle sentencing groups also involve a magistrate, but there are more people there, so maybe this sort of collaborative process can identify a more effective penalty. After all, circle sentencing involves spending more time with the offender and as well as also their victim, so maybe they get a better understanding of his or her circumstances. So to explore this idea, we control for the penalty imposed and see if circle sentencing is still associated with reoffending. Just so we're clear, here's how we do it. That is, here's how we control for the penalty imposed. Say these little green dots are offenders. Right now, what our model is doing is comparing all these little green dots to each other, including all the controls I just described earlier. When we include a penalty control, what we do is we limit our comparison to offenders that get the same penalty. So say this is a bond, this is a fine, for example. We limit our comparison to offenders that got the same penalty. That essentially controls for the penalty because everybody in our comparison is getting the same sanction. So first things first, here we're looking at the probability of reoffending. Over here in the red box is the result I showed you earlier on the graph, or a 3.9 percentage point reduction. Same thing, just on a table instead of a graph. When we control for the penalty, we can see the effect gets a little bit smaller and it's no longer statistically significant. There's no star there. When we look at the number of days until the first reoffense, again, looking over here, this is just replicating what I showed you earlier on the graph, although the number's a little different because this slide's out of date. Whoopsie. And then when we include the penalty controls, we can see that, again, the size of the effect gets a little bit smaller, but it remains statistically significant. So what do we learn from this? Well, this suggests that at least some of the association between circle sentencing and reoffending is driven by magistrates assigning different, potentially more effective penalties. So, question to be asking at this point is, all right, well, what penalties are they getting? Once again, this column is for people that get traditional sentencing, this is circle sentencing, and this is the difference. For example, we can see that offenders undergoing circle sentencing versus traditional sentencing are more likely to get a bond. So just so you know how to read this table, this says that 9.9% of people that undergo traditional sentencing get a bond with supervision, 31.3% of people undergoing circle sentencing get a bond with supervision, and that's an increase of 21.4 percentage points. So to draw this out, sort of high-level picture, if you undergo circle sentencing, you are way more likely to get a bond. Oops, wrong pencil again. You're more likely to get a bond. You are less likely to get a fine. You are less likely to go to prison. You're also less likely to get no penalty, so it's not just that you're getting off easy with nothing. You're also more likely to serve a community service order and more likely to get a suspended sentence with supervision. So two kind of key points to note here. One interesting thing is you're way less likely to get a fine, 22 percentage points less likely to get a fine. Remember from the other big table of descriptive statistics I showed you earlier, people going through circle sentencing are also from more disadvantaged areas. They're poorer. So they're both poorer and less likely to get a fine. Maybe the magistrates are assigning more effective penalties, right? That kind of hints at that. Second thing to note is that, well, people that go through circle sentencing are way more likely to be supervised, right? And that fact has implications for the next slide. So let's go to that now. So now we're looking at the second part of unpacking the reoffending result. And we're going to be looking at reoffending for specific offence types. So let's look up here in panel A. And now we're just looking at reoffending for a violent crime in this row here, a property crime, a drug crime, and so on. So from this row here, you can see that offenders undergoing circle sentencing are actually more likely to reoffend for a violent crime. How much more likely? 3.2 percentage points, right? However, they are also less likely to reoffend for a property crime, a traffic offence, an offence against justice procedures. So this result here, that they're more likely to reoffend for a violent crime, that's kind of troubling, right? Because violent crimes are really serious. How do we interpret this? Well, one explanation is that they're more likely to reoffend for a violent crime. After all, they were more likely to be coming up for a violent crime, so they've got like a kind of history of violence. However, it's also, maybe they're just more likely to be caught, right? So remember from the previous slide, we showed that they were more likely to be subject to some kind of supervision. Maybe this effect here is just because they're being more closely monitored. So really the control group are reoffending for violent crimes just as much, but these guys are just getting caught more often. So to try and address this issue, down here in panel B, we limit our analysis to specific reoffending for specific types of crimes, specifically a finite set of violent and property crimes. The violent crimes are homicide, robbery, and assault resulting in grievous bodily harm. What's the intuition? Well, these violent crimes are so serious that they rarely go undetected by police. The property crimes we look at are theft, motor vehicle theft, and break and enter. Intuition, victims have an incentive to report these crimes to police for insurance purposes. So we're trying to safeguard ourselves against this reporting or detection bias problem. So when we look at these two sets of crimes aggregated together, we can see that if you go through circle sentencing, you're 2 percentage points less likely to reoffend for either one. Good news. When we look just at violent crime, we can see that circle sentencing has no effect. However, this no effect could be because it just doesn't have an effect, or it could be because these violent crimes, remember, homicide, assault resulting in grievous bodily harm, and robbery just occur at such low frequencies. And when we look at just the property crimes, we can see a 2.5 percentage point reduction. So to summarize, we compare offenders going through circle sentencing to offenders undergoing traditional sentencing, net of controls and the parts of the eligibility criteria that we can also control for. Offenders undergoing circle sentencing are 9.3 percentage points less likely to be sent to prison. That's a drop from 18% to 8.7%. They're also less likely to reoffend. That's a drop from 40.5 to 36.6, 3.9 percentage point reduction. Some of this association might be because circle groups are able to assign better penalties. And it's not clear whether this net reduction is accompanied by an increase in reoffending for violent crime. When we look at days to the first reoffence, we can see that offenders undergoing circle sentencing take 63 days longer to reoffend. That's an increase from 478 to 533. Policy implications? Well, it costs the New South Wales government about $250 to incarcerate one person each day. Over the 2016-17 financial year, there were just over 3,000 Indigenous Australians held in custody in New South Wales. Therefore, a 1 percentage point decrease in the Indigenous incarceration rate equates to a saving of almost $8,000 a day, or when you aggregate it up, just shy of $3 million a year. Assuming there is no increase in reoffending, which is what we found, rolling out circle sentencing to other locations could work towards addressing Aboriginal overrepresentation in custody. One thing to remember is that this is from a 1 percentage point decrease. The estimates we found were in the order of a 9 percentage point decrease. That said, our estimates aren't causal, and some of this is probably due to selection bias. In any event, such locations would need a willing magistrate, cooperation from police, legal aid, access to drug and alcohol support services, and finally, a relatively large Indigenous population. And this is just the references. So if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch. I think the contact details for our info team's on the website, and they'll put you through to me. And if you want to learn more, you can read the full paper on the website. Thank you very much.